Bearwalker by Joseph Bruchac. Chapter 2. Trees. The miles are whipping by. We've gone from flat farmland to rolling hills. The once distant peaks of the Adirondacks have edged closer. They're tinged with the colors of autumn, that blood red of the maples and the yellow of the beeches flowing like colored patterns in a tapestry across the green, unchanging fabric of the spruce and pines and cedars. Whiteface Mountain rises up like a volcanic peak above the others. I'm actually feeling pumped. The thought of being among all those trees, big ones that I can get way up into, is making me feel happy as I look at those mountains that are growing larger and larger. I practically live in that big maple that grows out over the street behind Grandma Katiri's trailer. I think nothing about dangling out by one hand over the road for minutes at a time from my favorite high branch. Mom climbed plenty of trees when she was my age, and I imagine that was true for Grandma Katiri as well. After all, they were once bear cubs just like me. Among our nation, you inherit your clan from your mother's side. Grandma Katiri and Mom are both bears. My dad, being Turtle Clan, stayed out of trees. Maybe I'll find a 100-foot pine to climb. I've read that a few old pines in the Adirondack Park are almost as big as the ones that grew before the English and French took the tallest trees to make the masts of sailing ships. Entering Adirondack Park. I read that sign by the roadside aloud. It prompts Mr. Wilbur to say something in reply. He's just come back to his seat next to me after quelling some minor disturbance in the back of the bus. You know we won't actually be in the park itself, he says. Camp Chuckamuck is on private land, just outside the blue line. It is? I hadn't known that. Mr. Wilbur hears the disappointment in my voice. Don't worry, he reassures me. It's just as wild at Chuckamuck as anywhere inside the park. It was a family preserve before it became a camp, and they kept it pristine. It's still that way, despite the pressure being put on the owners to sell it to developers. Plus, it's way off the beaten track. You'll see when we get to the road that leads in. 10 miles of dirt. You're more likely to view megafauna here than anywhere else in the North Country. Moose and even... He pauses for effect and then just makes a growling sound. Bears, I say. I'm grinning now. Mr. Wilbur starts to say something else, but the sudden dramatic rise of a voice from behind us drowns out his words. All they found of that one kid was his hand, and all the fingers had been chewed off. I don't even have to turn around to know who it is. Willie Donner, of course. His foghorn tones reverberate through the whole bus. He's 3 rows back, trying to freak out the girls in the seat across from him with stories about the cannibal of Camp Chuckamuck. His name, Willie continues, pausing and lowering his voice for dramatic effect, was Jason Jones. His parents brought him to Camp Chuckamuck 20 years ago. He was huge for his age, but he wasn't really smart. The other kids teased him and played mean tricks. What they didn't know was that they were driving him crazy and that he was wicked strong. One night after they put a dead rat in his bed, he just ran screaming out into the night and never came back. No one could find him. But the next night, the boy who had put the rat into Jason Jones's bed vanished. A trail of blood led from his cabin into the woods. I take a quick look over my shoulder. Heidi and Tara, the 2 Willie's words are aimed at, have disinterested looks on their faces. But they're still listening as he gruesomely chronicles how one camper after another disappeared. They started finding things around the camp. There were piles of eyeballs that had been pulled out and human leg bones with tooth marks on them. Willie's voice gets louder again. He's approaching the climax. The state police finally tracked Jason Jones down to a cave in the forest. That cave was piled high with chewed human bones, and there was a big iron pot in which he was cooking up a batch of camper soup. Even though the police shot him again and again, he wouldn't die. He just kept coming at them until they finally had to use a flamethrower. I look over at Mr. Wilbur, who is rolling his eyes like I am. Like flamethrowers are standard issue for state troopers. Talk about over-embellishing. But before he died, engulfed in flames, Willie concludes, the last words Jason Jones howled were, "I'll be back." Mr. Wilbur has his head in his hands. Like me, he doesn't know whether to laugh or cry. Although I have to admit that some of the details of that story have creeped me out. But Willie isn't done yet. He leans toward Heidi and Tara, his voice a harsh whisper. Every year, the ghost of Jason Jones, the cannibal of Camp Chuckamuck, comes back to claim another victim. And this time, it might just be you! As he shouts that last word, Willie grabs Heidi by the arm and she screams. Mr. Wilbur stands up and turns around. He doesn't do it quickly, but he has a presence that makes people pay attention to him, whether in the classroom or on this bus full of overstimulated teenagers. He speaks just one word, firmly. Enough. Willie sinks back into his seat and directs his eyes forward. Heidi, who enjoys acting hysterical, stops screaming, even though she is still rubbing her wrist where Willie grabbed her. Tara, too cool to fall for Willie's tale of terror, just shakes her head in disgust. Mr. Wilbur slides back into his seat in one easy athletic motion. He was a gymnast in college. He's the only teacher I've ever had who can do a backflip. Urban myths, he said. Well, actually rural. An unconvincing melange of overworked motifs, I add, putting on my best professional voice. Mr. Wilbur chuckles and holds up his right hand to tick them off on his fingers. I know what you did last summer, he begins. Friday the 13th, I add. Halloween, he continues, shaking his head. Poor Jamie Lee Curtis. With a little touch of the Terminator, I conclude. I'll be back, Mr. Wilbur intones, nailing the Austrian cyborg accent. 3 seats back, Willie is talking again. Mr. Wilbur sighs but doesn't do anything. You can't keep a bad storyteller down. At least Willie is soft-pedaling it below foghorn level now. I can still hear him, though. You know, Willie says, Camp Chuckamuck was built on an old Indian graveyard. Now I roll my eyes. It always comes back to that. Every spooky place in America, it seems, was built on an old Indian graveyard. I'm as sick of hearing that as I am of being told that the only real Indians live west of the Mississippi. But Willie isn't finished yet. You know what the word Chuckamuck really means? He asked. It means place of many chewed bones. Now I'm ready to stand up, but Mr. Wilbur holds out his hand. I settle back in my seat. I understand. It's not the time or place to get into this. All I'd be doing would be knocking my head against the wall. But what Mr. Wilbur expects is that after a few days together here at the camp, things will change. We will learn in spite of ourselves, inspired, as the camp brochure reads, by the healthy outdoor atmosphere and the natural environment of Camp Chuckamuck, whose name means place of happy meetings in the language of the first peoples of this land. I think it's a faint hope. People don't change overnight, even in a healthy outdoor atmosphere. The bus bumps and sways into a turn. I look out the window. We've just turned onto that dirt road Mr. Wilbur mentioned. Hills crowd in on either side, and evergreen trees are thick all around us. It's almost like we're going into a tunnel that leads to another reality. Thinking of reality, Chuckamuck is not a word that means place of happy meetings in the Mohawk language. In Mohawk, it doesn't mean anything. That's par for the course when it comes to most outdoor education places. They like to use phony Indian names. Either they spell them wrong or don't translate them right, or they just plain make up some weird word that they think sounds Native American. I'm feeling sort of depressed now, despite the trees and the chance of seeing a bear. Too many things are going through my head, especially that image of Jason Jones's cannibal cave full of bones. I know the yarn that Willie was spinning is just a crock, but it's made me think of another tale. One that really is old and traditional. There was a real cave full of chewed human bones in the story of the monster bear.